Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, in the spirit of our ancestors, I want to greet you today for our Humanity Rising session. We are very fortunate today to find ourselves in the middle of Holy Week in the Christian religion. And the Jewish religion with Passover and Easter. So it's a time of consecration, and it's a time for a connection with the sacred. And we thought that would be an optimal moment to have a conversation with Apela Colorado, who's been an elder at the Ubiquity University and in our wisdom school since the creation of the university back in 2005. So we're going to have a dialogue with her on her new book, A Woman Between the Worlds, which came out of her life experience as both an Indigenous woman, but also a woman of Celtic and French ancestry, and how she, like all of us, traverse different worlds at different times in our lives, and the wisdom that she has brought to her vocation of assisting Indigenous people all around the world. So that's our program today. We thought we would start with a natural soundscape for our blessing that Apela has provided. Just to center ourselves in the living nature out of which we all came. Apela will then give us a blessing as we begin our program today, and then she and I will have a dialogue about her life.
The great directions of life, the character shaping moments. May we be in one now towards your life that you give us, Sungwai Dizo, creator, creatress, stepping forward between the worlds in awakeness and consciousness, our earth between worlds. Who are we? Where are we? How is it I see myself coming towards myself? Me, but not me. Strange, yet intimately familiar. In this moment of mirroring, in this moment of confrontation of self with life of our truth. Where do we stand? How do we stand? Where is the unity? Where is the relation? Woman between the worlds. We call to you now this morning and ask for your blessings and help in this conversation. May we be one in your aegis, in your love, and your power. who I know all my relations.
Thank you, Apela.
Morning,
Thank
Jim.
you, everyone. Apela's in Hawaii, so it's 5 o'clock in the morning for her right now, but she's gotten a cup of coffee and is ready to go. So thank you for getting up at an ungodly hour, Apela, for this. Apela is a very special person in my life and a very special person in the history of Ubiquity University and our journey to Chartres and the Chartres Academy and our wisdom school. So I've known her for many years, and I had the privilege of reading her book while it was still in draft form and providing an endorsement for it. And it's an extraordinary story of just as the title says, of a woman between the worlds. So what we want to do, everyone, today is just hear Apela tell her story. And I'll tease out various things that I know she's done and accomplished in her life, and we'll dialogue from there. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. So Apela, welcome to Humanity Rising. And why don't we just start, with you just telling us about your childhood and how you were shaped in your indigenous culture and how you began to come into an awareness that there were different worlds swirling around you as you were growing up.
Sure. When I look back now, it's strange to me to to have lived through such sweeping changes in our country and our land. When I grew up, I lived in a house where we didn't have running water, we didn't have electricity. And I talk about this in the book, just, going out in the winter and getting wood, digging wood out of a frozen wood pile for the wood stove and drinking water from a bucket. And in the morning in the winter, you have to break the ice on the top of the bucket to get a drink. And having to run to the outhouse when you're a kid in the middle of the night on icy paths and falling asleep in winter and hearing the snow sweeping around the house and that lonely aching howl of a wolf. When I left my house in the morning and when we kids went out to play, we always had to be mindful of predators, of wolves, of bear, of an encounter, snakes, things like that. So I didn't know that I would be among the last generations of Americans to grow up that way. It was a good way too, because without television, without radio, what do you do? Well, we read, right? And I developed just a passion for reading that my parents encouraged early on.
Now, where were you? Just so we have a sense, where physically were you? And what was the situation of your parents? Were you on a reservation? Were you just up in the woods somewhere? Give us a little bit more texture.
Okay, I lived in the far north of Wisconsin, right on the Upper Peninsula border. The Oneida Reservation was about 200 miles south of us, but we Oneida people have a history where when we were moved from New York, some of us never agreed to signing a treaty. And if we didn't agree to sign a treaty, then you didn't end up on the Oneida Reservation. And my family back in the day, didn't believe in that. And so we lived in this really isolated environment, right? Deep in the North Woods. And that was a fabulous way to grow up. My father, my grandfathers, they all worked in the woods with horses, and they did selective logging. You go out and walk through the woods and they would pick what trees were ready to be cut, and not the clear cut stuff that we see, in modern technology. So it was a really quiet life. And my grandfather, my mother's father, Merle David Patno, that I dedicate the book to, he was the person that gave me my Oniata Aga, or my Oneida culture. And he never ever would have said to me as a child, I'm going to give you your Oneida culture. It's how we lived it. Yeah.
Amazing. And were there other Oneida tribal people around you? Were you just sort of living alone in the forest as a kind of a nuclear family? Because you were so far out of any known social milieu, any kind of urban life. It's amazing. So you cultivated everything. Were there stores around? I mean, how
No,
isolated were you at the beginning then?
we lived on a lake. We were the only people on the lake in the
Amazing.
morning. Early morning, I could look and I could see deer come and drink across the lake from us. And nobody lived around us. Some people would come up in the summertime from Chicago, and they would have like a cottage, but we were basically alone on the lake. In the wintertime, we would use snowshoes and walk across the frozen lake. Like, I knew every plant, every twig intimately. Just the forest was the forest, and the animals that were our friends. The other, yes, I would say yes, there were other Oneida, because my father's mother had 13 children, right? So we had our own tribe, right? It was a big extended family. So when I went to school, I went to a one-room grade school, and there were myself and one other child that was the whole first grade. Amazingly, in that one room school, like in graduation, by the time I got to 8th grade, there were 4 of us, and out of the 4 of us in that one room school, 2 of us went on to get PhDs. So
Really?
one teacher scattered across 8 classes. All the kids had to help teach other kids, and worked.
Extraordinary. That's extraordinary. So you grew up in this kind of one-room schoolhouse. It's like Abraham Lincoln, everyone.
I know. By the way, my birthday is February 12th, Abraham Lincoln's birthday. So
maybe you're a reincarnation. That's amazing. So you grew up in this one-room, were educated in a one-room schoolhouse, and then you became a teenager. How did you experience being a teenage young woman in this kind of environment? Did you want to leave it? Were you just restless to go into the big city? What was it like being a teenager?
No, I absolutely didn't want to go to the big city. I didn't even know a big city. I never left the North Woods until we did. The Canadian woodcutters and so forth took over the big paper companies and everything. They all switched from contracting with independent loggers like my family to big deals and clear cutting, and they moved to Canada. And then there was no work for my family. So and the other thing was, my grandfather had a small sawmill, and it burned down. So the family was just wiped out. And I do remember, like, one time opening the cupboard, and all that was in there to eat was like a half a jar of peanut butter and some oatmeal. So it was do or die. So my family moved down to the city of Milwaukee in the middle of my first year of high school. And so I went from my grade school to a high school that was at the time the biggest high school in the country, 3,000 students.
No kidding.
That was
Wow.
shocking and horrifying. And I didn't fit in. I didn't look like I fit in. I didn't talk the same way. I didn't know how to, like, make my hair or makeup or anything like that. It was actually really traumatic. And I would fall asleep at night, with the kind of neon light flooding my bedroom, and crying and missing the North Woods.
Wow. What kind of a job did your father manage to get?
I had an uncle who had a business in Milwaukee, and they were working basically like in construction, cleaning buildings, like chemically washing stone buildings and things like that, which
Amazing.
was kind of appropriate because Oniata Aga means people of the everlasting stone. In English, you say Oneida tribe.
Gotcha. Well, your experience reminds me of myself in some ways. I was out in the boondocks of Taiwan as a missionary kid, and we had a few more people in our school, but I can still remember coming back when I was actually 15 and going to a junior high school that had 1,200 students. And I had never experienced, a mass group of anything before. And I can still remember walking in, the doorbell rang. I knew I had supposed to show up at 8:00. And all of a sudden there was like these hundreds and hundreds. And I got so anxious that I just went to the wall and I just stood with my back to the wall until most of the kids had passed. But I remember being terrified at the number of kids that were in this school and wondered, how on earth am I going to cope with this? So I can imagine what you were feeling as you went to a school of 3,000 people. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So how did you navigate? What was your navigation strategy?
Well, it was complicated in the sense that where I got my strength was from being in nature in the North Woods. And that was taken from me. And that mattered because I came from a really heavy drinking family, huge extended family, everybody really loyal to each other, and everybody really, really drinking. And when we got to the city, the drinking intensified. So I did what a lot of people do. I looked at my family and I said, I will never, ever, I will not be that. So that was part of my coping strategy, and withdrawal and reading more. And by that time I'd already had I might have turned to Catholicism, but I had run into a pedophile priest, and I escaped him. I write about that in the book. I escaped him, but boy, the betrayal was there, and I didn't trust going there. So what I had was me and my books, and basically depression, and then defiance, like I will never be this,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And always I will say this, there was always a deep spirituality in me. And that looking back, that's what got me through. But I didn't have any ways. And right at that time too, my first year in the big city, my grandfather died. So there was the cultural connection because he was, wow, cats outside. He was the only one that really carried the culture in our family.
Mm-hmm. So you were really adrift.
Oh yeah.
You didn't have that kind of cultural connection, the big city, your family, the alcohol. So you went into your interiority. That's how you move forward and started to piece together a spiritual pathway and I would say personal discipline that led you into essentially academic excellence, because you continued your education until you finally got a PhD.
And my grandfather used to say, before we left the North Woods, and I would get to see my grandmother and grandfather maybe once or twice a month, and the whole family be sitting together on a Sunday, and they'd be smoking and drinking and visiting and playing cards or just whatever they were doing. And my grandfather I was his favorite grandchild, and he would hold me on his lap. And I knew I was his favorite too. And I really liked that. So anyway, he held me on his lap and he said, when Apela grows up, she's going to go to college. And everybody would listen because my grandfather was the head of the family. And of course, like no one in our family ever went to college, didn't really even know what it was, but really believed that education was the way to the way forward, and especially for Native Americans to get out of the poverty and the oppression, that education would be the elixir, the magic potion that would make things work out. And I never forgot that, right? And when he passed away, I was in high school in the city, and then when he was gone, that's when I truly felt just empty inside. And I remembered he said, get an education. So there was a University of Wisconsin had an extension in Milwaukee. So I knew that institution, those buildings existed. So I made my way there, and that's how I started university. And I didn't know it. I kept going, Jim. I went for my bachelor's, and then, okay, now I'm going to do my master's. And then one of my professors, Dr. Robert O. Washington, an African-American man, really urged me and helped me to get into my PhD program. And it wasn't until I got stuck in my doctorate degree, I went to this restaurant called Mug and Muffin in Cambridge Square at Harvard. And I was having breakfast one day, and I was like, oh my God, I've been stuck for almost a year. I don't know why I can't do this. What is it? And all of a sudden it just came in my mind, and I saw that in my mind, it was, if I got the right degree, my grandfather would be back in my life again. That was somewhere in the back of my mind. And when I realized, like, what I imagined is, okay, now I'm going to graduate. I'm visualizing I'm graduating with my PhD. I would go up on the platform and then walk down, get my diploma, walk down. And when I walked down, in my mind's eye, who I was looking for was Grandpa, and he wasn't there. And then I really had a cry. And just then the waitress comes up, is there something wrong? Can I get you anything? Says, no, I'm having a catharsis, right? But understanding that I was looking for him was a big shift for me. And
Yeah,
we played the soundscape opening this talk. You notice at the end there was a crow, caw, caw. My grandfather's name in French is like a black bird, and he was that way. He was really, really loving and warm. Like, he was actually the only person in my hard drinking family that I had an emotional connection to. Like, when I would see him as a child, I would go running to be held in his arms, and everybody else was disconnected, separate from each other, watching and loyal, but separate. Yeah. So
now, what did you do your PhD on? What was your dissertation on?
it was in social policy, but what I was looking at is American Indian alcoholism as an issue of survival. And I was looking at the emergence of addiction and alcohol from the time of the conquistadors up to then it was Ronald Reagan, because I was trying to heal my family, Jim, and wanted to heal my people. And I thought, every degree I got, I thought, well, this will give me the answer, right? But with the day I did my doctoral defense, I called home, and my dad answered. It was a Friday evening, and I told him, I said, I just passed my examination. And he said, that's it? You're all done? It's over? I said, yeah. And he said, well, your mother and me are proud of you. He says, we're going to go out and get a drink. Talk to you later. So I never converted anybody.
By the way, just as a parenthesis here, what did you conclude about the presence of alcoholism in the Native American community? Because it's quite unique and it's very powerful, and there's been some suggestions that there's some genetic disposition that makes Native Americans more susceptible to alcohol effects and alcohol addiction. Obviously, there's the factor of the breakdown of the culture that makes them more vulnerable. How did you come out, having done a whole PhD on the matter?
At the time, you have to realize this is before internet, Google, or anything, and
Yeah,
even
yeah.
libraries weren't digitized. And things would happen in my research. One time I was on a plane, some guy left a newspaper. He was sitting next to me, a businessman, and there was an article from the World Health Organization on Indigenous addiction. It was exactly what I needed. So the role of the ancestors in my research was really, really important in those days. But essentially, I reviewed like 200 different researches on American Indian alcoholism. And out of the 200, there were 198 different opinions on what caused drinking and alcoholism among American Indian people. And underneath it all, of course, was the genocide, right? And not only the genocide, but outlawing the practice of Indigenous spirituality. So my thesis was that if we could practice again our ceremonies and have our identity back, that you would see a reduction or elimination of alcohol. It seems a no-brainer now, but at the time it was extremely radical. My work was highly challengeable. By luck, I found a case study of the Tarahumara in Mexico, and in ceremonies they drink vast quantities of like locally brewed and fermented alcohol, and in these 4-day ceremonies drink so much there's a state of intoxication to get to the other world, right? The other, like that. But apart from that, no problems with addiction and no using it outside of ceremony. So that was a case study I'd been looking for. So I was making the case, let us have our culture, our ceremonies back, and we'll recover. And I mean, for me, I got into, when I went into I had informal ceremonies with my grandfather growing up. But when I was like late teens, early 20s, I became active in the American Indian movement. And for a while, the national headquarters was right in Milwaukee at the American Indian Center where I worked. And AIM, American Indian Movement, promoted the same idea that we're getting our power back, right? And it was the first time I got into really ancient ceremonies like the pipe ceremonies and sweat that had been suppressed. I mean, people listening, you probably would be shocked to know that this morning you saw me burning cedar. Well, when I grew up, you couldn't do that. And if you're on a reservation, you can like have food rations taken from you, everything, for doing things like that. And now you go into a New Age bookstore and can buy it. But in those days, there were severe penalties. We were not allowed to practice our religion, or it's not even a religion, our spirituality until 1978 in the American Indian Freedom of Religion law. And I got to be a part of the committee that drafted that law.
Beautiful, beautiful. Tell us a little more about your experience with the American Indian movement, because that was such an upsurge, with Leonard Pelletier and Wounded Knee and everything that went on. There was both an exuberance and a militancy and a counter oppression that came down. How did you navigate? How did you experience that kind of rise in Native American self-identity?
Yeah, for me, the call came. I walked into my parents' house back from my university classes one day, and they had television on, and it was at Wounded Knee, and I'll never forget it. The camera zoomed in on Russell Means, and you saw the church in the background. He had on a ribbon shirt, and there was like an eagle feather on one side woven into his hair, and it would just move a little bit like this in the wind. And then I can't even remember what he said, but I remember in my mind's eye, even right now, like, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. That's the thing right there. And then I got a placement at the American Indian Council on Alcohol, which turned out to be the AIM headquarters. And what was so beautiful about it is that the center brought in elders from really intact tribes in the West, like the Sioux, the Lakota, And we also got people from our own, since we'd been moved from the East Coast, we got elders and cultural people coming from our Iroquois relatives in upstate New York and in Southeast Ontario. So we began to put the ceremonies and our identity back together. And there's one moment, I think it's in the book too, where we young people, like, we had all ribbon shirts made and everything, and it's like, yeah, power to the people, right on, man, and we're all like revved up. We're doing something, and we're getting our identity back, and we have lots of energy and lots of anger, the way young people do, about getting things right in this land. And we're going on and talking about all the problems and what the white man did to all of us. And there's a Sioux elder leaning against the cinder block wall of the Indian center, like this, skinny and kind of raggedy, clean clothes, gray hair. And after about a half hour of our meeting, he just cleared his throat, and we all went silent, like, ah, here comes him. And he just said this. He leaned forward and he said, "The power is not lost. You are." We were so mad. Who let him in here? So, and then he also told me another thing that helped me as a person of mixed descent. He said, when the white man remembers again who he is, we can sit together as equals and work out our differences. And I thought, wow, remembers again who he is. And the part of the white part of me said, there's hope. I can remember again who I am, and then work out our differences. Yeah, that means inside myself too, the half of me that's victim, the half of me that's oppressor. Maybe there's a way for integration here, or some coming to peace with each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. By the way, someone's asking for your understanding of the Row Wampum from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I have a big flag up outside my house fluttering in the wind now of the Row Wampum. The Row is essentially the purple wampum is made from, the beads are made from it's a bivalve freshwater shell, and where it's sort of, I don't know what you call it, the seam where they come together like that. Take that and cut it out, and that's your bead. It takes a very long time to get these. So there's purple and white, and it's essentially a white belt with two purple horizontal stripes going on it. And the stripes are like considered to be, it was ourselves and white people that came to the East Coast, and that the agreement amongst ourselves was that we were from two separate people, two separate tracks, but we would go along in this white field of peace, that we would be bound together, and are in reality held together in what my people say, the great law of peace. We're bound together in that's our context, that's our unified field, and we're still unique in that. We're one and we're unique at the same time.
Mm, mm, mm. And another thing that's just coming to my mind is your sense of the history. Oftentimes the people in the United States think that we're the oldest democracy because we've been around for about 240 something years. But you have a much deeper understanding of history. The United States is actually quite young and immature, and that the Iroquois and other tribes have a much longer continuous legacy and tradition around democracy. I think people would be interested in hearing about that and your sense of the depth of the Native American governance and traditions in the democratic process?
Yeah, well, I'm not a longhouse chief, so I'm not qualified to speak in that kind of level. But what I can say is my people had a time when we migrated up from the southwest, probably 20,000 years ago. And when we arrived in the Northeast, we went through about 500 years of warfare, fighting with each other. And it just got really, really bad. And people can't survive in conditions of warfare all the time. You don't have time to take care of yourself or your people or grow your food or whatever. So eventually, there was a man in our people who went on a walk, and he had a vision come to him, and the vision was the great law of peace, and it was from he was at a waterfall when it came to him. And we have a constitution, and we have a ceremony of reciting that constitution. And actually, the founding fathers of the United States, Ben Franklin especially, came and studied with my people and wrote the Articles of Confederation for the US. And with that in mind, the only thing I always say that Ben didn't get right is, from our Constitution compared to the US Constitution, he left out, and the founding fathers left out, the rights of women and the rights of nature. And that has turned out to be a tragic omission. I did find out, though, I studied under a traditional storyteller for a number of years, Chief Danawak, who I also write about in the book. And the first story he ever told me opens this way. This is the first story. There are no stories before this. This story comes from the time before the Earth's crust was healed or formed. And what the purpose of the story is, or the lesson of the story is, never put yourself above another person. Keep yourself low, right? So even in terms of US democracy is fledgling and really, really suffering right now. And the problem is, without including women and nature, you don't have the contextual, the quality control index. There's no index of coherence to it without that.
Exactly.
And it's dangerous, So lest I get up on my high horse, in my work in my nonprofit Worldwide Indigenous Science Network, which is 31 years old now, we work with Indigenous elders and healers all over the world to support them and keep the knowledge alive and going through cultural exchanges of various kinds. And I met a man named Dabasa Gayo, who is Oromo from the southern highlands of Ethiopia. And he'd been living in exile in Kenya because the last government, the Tigray government, were tribal people from the north, and it was a really, really fascist government, and they were oppressing other indigenous people just mightily. And the boss's life was threatened many times. He was in his 70s, but because he was a spiritual figure in his tribe, the secret police were after him. So Dabasa shared with me his story and their government, and it turns out that they're older than we are, and they have a democracy, and strangely enough, it almost was built along the same lines as ours, and it's still in place. So our democracy is about 2,000 years old, and Dabasa's would have been a few thousand years older than that even. But he was Ethiopian secret services crossed the border into Kenya, and they kidnapped him, they tortured him, and they murdered him. That was about 6 years ago. Wow. Because he was a cultural center of his people. and they wanted to break his people down.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I wanted to raise this issue of democracy and so forth because I just finished reading David Grieber's and David Wingrove's book, Brief History of Everything.
Yeah.
And in it, they postulate that the rise of the democratic impulse in Europe and in the West that actually fed into the French Revolution and the American Revolution came from the indigenous North American critique of the early European incursions into North America. It's a very interesting story that I would recommend to everyone to fill out what Apela is just indicating, that, particularly when the French and British came into Canada and the northeast of the United States, they actually had some very deep and extended conversations with the indigenous people that were there. Mm-hmm. And once they figured out the language and so forth, and a number of the indigenous people actually traveled to Europe.
Yes.
So Montesquieu and Rousseau and the great Enlightenment intellectuals were motivated with this critique of the Western European monarchical system from a democratic point of view. And in one of the great debates that they had, the Native American man emphasized that at the heart of any democratic governance is the right to disobey.
Yes.
You don't always have to do what the chief tells you to do. And all over North America, there's examples where the chief is the chief, but people have the right to obey or disobey depending on whether they like what he's saying. And the other part of the critique was you have the right to move away. There's no sense of serfdom in the North American, whereas in Europe, everybody was locked in to a hierarchical order where democracy was impossible because there was no right to dissent and no right to mobility. And it was that impulse that came in intellectually and philosophically that gave rise to the Enlightenment process that generated the American and the French Revolution. So it's not only that Benjamin Franklin was talking to these guys. 100 years before Benjamin Franklin was talking to them, they were having a very profound dialogue around issues of governance. So this notion of the noble savage or the primitives just is a complete myth. They were highly sophisticated people that had thought about this for a very long time.
Yes. One of our chiefs that was over in France looked around and he said something to the effect like, if we treated our people, the leadership, the way that you're treating yours, we would rise up and kill all of you,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so anyway, Apela, so you did your PhD, you started to become aware, and it was at that point that you created the World Indigenous Science Network, because you've gone all over the world and assisted Indigenous people in all kinds of circumstances. Tell us that pathway. How did you get into that modality? Because the World Indigenous Science Network is now a major nonprofit organization worldwide.
Yeah, it's Worldwide Indigenous Science Network, in case anybody's Googling WISN. I did that after my PhD because I said earlier, the elder said, the power's not lost, you are. And I found out we Oneida people in Wisconsin who had been relocated and lost so much of our culture, we found out we could get that power back. And when I was in ceremonies and so forth, even Sundance, I would see white people, Black people, whoever, kind of crash the ceremonies, like desperate to belong and not having a place. And I thought, you know what? White people have really been like cheated, and like our American Indian ways have been devastated. But for white people, they're lost and don't even know it, you know. And then I got confronted with my own whiteness. It came like through dreams, and then I got breast cancer, and more it became clear to me I had to reckon with that side of myself. And I did. And to this day, Jim, you know, because you've been to France with me, I followed my genealogy back. We have one that goes back to the 1200s, and I traced it down to a little community, Paternoster, which is right near the Painted Caves of France. And I go there every year. And sometimes through Ubiquity University, we take students there as well to go into one of the diaspora points of humanity from out of Africa, where we still shared one language, one fire. We were one people. You go into those caves, and you're in a time before there was a United States, before there was a China, before there was a Europe. They're just fresh and alive, and you realize, like, I can be in this mindset. I don't have to be in my disconnected, oil-consuming, life-destroying way that I'm doing it, right? So when I researched my French ancestry, I found my indigenosity. And to me, the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network, the university courses we do, it's all about opening that up for people, opening our capacity to remember how to be in relation with the rest of life. And that's the great law.
Right, exactly. And I know you've been in the Central Asian republics as part of the work of WISN. Tell us a few kind of stories of like you were describing in Ethiopia, but in different places in the world, as you experience indigenous cultures worldwide over the last 30 years, what are the principal challenges that they've been confronted by, and how have you counseled them to cope?
The main challenge, as I see it, is that much of the world is dissociative. And a colleague of mine, a psychologist, calls it the normative pathology of dissociation, where we're all disconnected. We've all been robbed. We no longer live in our creation story, why we came to this place and take on three-dimensional forms. We've lost connection with that. And this is a between the world time, because a big cycle, a 26,000-year-old cycle of precession of equinox is coming to a close, and a new one is open. And at this time, when you come full cycle, at the end, you can see the beginning, and there's a choice before us. And the choice is death or rebirth, renewal. The Hopis even have a rock with this petroglyph, with this inscribed. It looks like road like this and one like that. And one has plants and things flourishing, and the other is the end. So we're here now between the worlds. And one reason we'd be having this conversation today is it's the moment for this conversation. We do have a choice. We don't have to be like lemmings going over the cliff. We can choose life. And it's the thing that's so important, Jim, which I know you stand for in your work, is to know who we are, to reclaim our power. We first must look into our shadow. I had to look into my French shadow, for example. I was in the west coast of Africa, and there's also, I think there's a chapter of that experience in the book too. I'm really ill, recovering from radiation from breast cancer. And I end up there in the company of a group of doctors who are my friends, who are working. They're African Americans and working in Africa. And they said, come to these traditional ceremonies and don't worry, we know you're recovering, but we're right here with you. If anything happens, we'll help you. So I went. And one day we had an outing. We took this beat up old boat. It didn't look like it could go more than about 50 feet without sinking. And it was overcrowded. And we went to this little island. You could see it, Guri Island, from the shore. And I got there and it's all kind of white sand and bougainvillea fluorescent all over, and like adobe buildings that were painted pastels and looked so pretty. But as I approached, I had this sense of dread. I had a reason, it turned out. We went to this house of slaves, and this was a building where
Wow.
Africans that were going to be sold into slavery went to. I'm watching the time here, Jim. So as I went through this building, just this feeling of the more and more like horrifying stuff was coming out. Here's where women were shackled against the wall. Here's where women were bred by white guys. And here's a hole where they throw recalcitrants into. Then we walked up in this tower, and there was a doorway that looked down in these rocky shoals beneath. It's called the Door of No Return. And metaphorically, I'd say that's about where we're at as a species right now, the door of no return. So slaves that didn't want to get on, people that would be slaves but didn't want to be slaves, they had a choice. They could jump out of this door onto the shark-infested shoals below, or they got on the boat, right? And when I'm there and I'm hearing all these horrifying stories, and I'm so sick and weak, and I'm packed in with people, I'm the only non-African in the room, right, in this tower. And I lean against the wall, and it seemed like I could hear and feel the screams. And then I found out that upstairs in this building was a very nice posh area that people, the slave owners and sellers, lived there. And then I found out it was French people that did that. And in some way, I share the culpability. As an Indigenous Oneonta woman, I also know the outcome of that culpability. It was absolutely devastating. And that was a key moment in my life where I knew I was going to do the work of the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network, because I might or might not be responsible for what my ancestors did, but I am making myself responsible now.
Mm, mm, mm. Wow, that must have been a powerful experience. And the whole metaphor of the door of no return is so apt to our global situation now. So what the slaves back then were confronted by, all of us
Yes.
are now in that moment. Now that leads to a question in my mind, back to the title of A Woman Between the Worlds. So all this time now, you're realizing that you embody Indigenous American blood,
Mm-hmm.
history, and French, Celtic history. And as you began to contemplate these things, how did you bring them all together in your head, in your psyche, in your heart, in your soul? Because you're both the victim and the victimizer,
Yes.
the perpetrator and the perpetrated upon simultaneously in one being.
Well, Jim, as you know, I'm looking at part of the resolution of that when I look at you right now, because we took a trip to France in, I think, 2005, and we ended
2005.
up at a place called Chartres. And I also have in my French genealogy people that came from the Champagne Valley, which is just next door to Chartres. So I'm certain they would have been there. But when I got to Chartres with Jim and a group of people, we did a ceremony, and my people are the great law of peace, Ganakgoa. That's the living tree. We see it now. We don't have the tree that we had in the South, the tree of like the long shining leaves, but the pine tree is our metaphor now, as eagle above it, and then with the great white roots of peace have war clubs buried underneath it, right? So that background, when we got to Chartres, I came upon a tree down by some streams that below the hill of the cathedral. And the hill is you guys call it, Jim, the Vatican, the central sacred site of the Gaul Carnute people. Those are my ancestors, right? So for me to be there, it was just thrilling because I'm tapping into something that runs deep in the soul life of my people writ large, right? And we did a ceremony. It was a simple ceremony by a tree making an offering. And it was at that tree that Jim Garrison had a vision. And out of that vision came the birth of, we called it the New Chart Mystery School. I wish we still did. Now it's called the New Chart Academy. And it's been going on for 16, this year will be our 17th year. And when we, all the years we're working there, by year 2, 3, or 4, my dream came true. Something started coming to me. And the something was a ceremony having to do with dreams, which we do now every year. And it's unlike anything that's done in the whole field of dream work. And I didn't plan it, it evolved. And the other thing I would say is that what Jim and I didn't know in 2005 is that about 6 or 7 weeks before we arrived, municipal workmen in the small town of Chartres had dug into a small first century Gallo-Roman cave. They were working on a car park, and they dug into this cave. They called the archaeologists, and in this tiny cave at the top of the hill, now it's out in front of where McDonald's is. They dug into this cave, and in a niche, they found a box. And this box, when they got it open, had contained a treasure, and the treasure was the only complete Gaul ritual set ever found. So in my mind, when Jim and I and our group arrived there, I went on at midnight one night, and I had this horn made because I knew old time Gaul people called to the spirit, the ancestors, that way. So at midnight, I went tiptoeing out, and with some trepidation, blew the horn on top of the hill, calling to the ancestors, like, here's who I am, here's my genealogy. Sorry, we never remembered you guys for a long time, but please, I really want my ceremonies and identity back, right? So I blew the horn and all that, and then nothing seemed to happen for 2 or 3 years. And then I found out one day that that set had been found, and it took 14 years. But the last year we were in residence at Chartres, and with the help of Mary Lou Bell, who is a local, I finally got to see the ritual set. First time, and then Timothy Bramley, who comes to Chartres, a Maori man, other people, we did a prayer with it, a chant and a prayer, much to the trepidation of the academics there, but they had it all laid out on the table for us really nicely. But they were very nervous about Indigenous types being there. And we realized we were the first person to pray with that set since the Gauls had put it away. Wow. So no accident, we're there. It's a time of remember and renewal, and I hope rejoicing.
Wow. By the way, I'd like to kind of fill out the story that Apela just told. First, when I first really encountered Apela was back in 1995. And we were working with Mikhail Gorbachev, and we had a great assemblage of world leaders: Maggie Thatcher, George Bush Sr., Ted Turner. It was live on CNN. Everything was going on. And I knew I needed to find somebody that could open it. Who would be the first voice as the proceedings began? And people said, Archbishop this and Rabbi that and Swami that. And I looked at them all, and then it came to me, what about Apela? So I contacted Apela, and it's one of the most moving experiences I've ever had, ever. Just imagine a vast hall, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, on top of Nob Hill, where they signed the charter of the United Nations back in 1945. Very historic, very ornate. All the leading political figures in the world and in entertainment and movie stars and social activists and nearly 1,000 people. Who gives the voice? And little old Apela walked out on that stage, and there was a kind of a commotion, and she just stood there. And everyone got silent. And into that silence, she invoked the spirit with such elegant simplicity that everyone knew that we had entered into sacred space. So that gives everyone a measure of at least my experience. And I still remember Mr. Gorbachev saying to me after the proceedings had begun, that was a powerful moment, he said. That was true power. And then later, many years later, in around 2004, it was Apela that brought me into the university through some dreams that she had in the university. It was founded by Matthew Fox, was foundering. They needed new leadership. And it was Apela that dreamed me into the university that has now become Ubiquity. And it was Apela that said to me, the only way that I would flourish as president and the institution would flourish is if I dedicated my tenure to Mary Magdalene and the Black Madonna. And that's how the pilgrimage that she described to Chartres in October of 2005 with, I think we had about 45 students, all of us together, retracing the steps of Mary Magdalene in France. We went down to Roc Amador, which is the site of the most powerful Black Madonna in Europe. That's where we started. And then we ended up in Chartres. And it was just the story of the tree. It was the last day. It was a hot day. And we wanted to, Apela said, we have to find the tree. And I didn't think much about it, but I figured she was going to walk outside of where we were staying in the a little hotellerie called Maison Saint-Yves and find a tree just sort of by the building. And she says, no, that's not the right tree. And so she started to march down the hill, where the cathedral's on top of a big hill, started to march down the hill. And so you can imagine, 40 people, in various stages of hunger and thirst and exhaustion from a 2-week trip, following Apela as she marched. And I kept pointing out trees. I said, Apela, there's a tree. And she says, nope, it's not the right tree. We walked for quite a while. It was at least, I'd say, 15, 20 minutes. And I was getting completely exasperated.
Yeah.
Came to the river, a river that was there in Chartres. And she stopped and she pointed to the other side of the river and said, there's the tree. And we crossed the bridge and we went, and it was at that tree that I was encountered and others. And that was the genesis of the mystery school that Ubiquity convenes and our wisdom school convenes every year in Chartres. That's our sanctum sanctorum. That's our sacred heart of the university. And I would say of my life, making pilgrimage to Chartres every year. And it turned out that 2006 was going to mark the 1,000th anniversary of the founding of the original Chartres Academy by an Italian priest called Fulbert, who founded it as a place for teaching the ancient classical liberal arts. So each year we have gone into Chartres and we contemplate one of the liberal arts. And so starting in 2006, we've had 2 cycles of 7. And now we're on our third liberal art of our third cycle, which is rhetorica. And rhetorica is under the aegis of Venus, the goddess Venus, Aphrodite in the Greek. And so it's, how do you manifest love? How do you embody love? And a spirit this year of apology and reconciliation and healing as we come out of a pandemic, but we're still in the midst of a war in Europe. We're going to be making pilgrimage after 2 years of not being able to go to Chartres. But this year, 2022, between the 13th and the 19th of August, we're going to be in Chartres. And in fact, I'll put the link in a moment here. But that's just some texture around Apela's entry into the university and her guidance of me and guidance of the university as we've continued over the years, fitfully with many mistakes and detours and so forth, to follow the inner illumination of the sacred feminine emanating from Chartres in such a powerful way to guide us and really lead us in the way that we need to be led in a completely chaotic world, which, as Apela said, we're now looking at the door of no return. So the question is, how do we comport ourselves? How do we remember who we were and who we are by going back to our roots? And it's within this context, Apela, I'd love for you to talk about the importance of all of us, whoever you are, wherever you are, of coming into a relationship with your indigenous roots. Because most of us never think about that. But for you, it's the cornerstone of identity. So speak to us about the importance of finding our indigenous lineage and roots, and how that affects your life and your spiritual coherence.
The thing is, for most of my life, and especially in my 20s, I was really an at-risk person, because whatever world I was in, white world or native world, there was always half of me left at the door. And I felt like an imposter everywhere. And I became really, really at risk. I had some really, really dark moments. And when I became a mother, one day I was changing my daughter's diapers, and I looked down at her, and I thought, I was involved in the American Indian movement at the time. And I looked down at her and I was thinking, what is it that I give to her? I can't, like, my identity is just being enraged at my situation, enraged at what's happened to American Indians, enraged that I'm, half white and have done all of this stuff to American Indians. And, it's just what, who, what? And that was the dangerous point. And then it was the elders coming in through the American Indian movement, exposure to the ceremonies again. And the first time I was in a peyote ceremony, the Eagle staff came around, and I put my hand on it. It's a stick with some eagle feathers on it. I put my hand on it, and I could feel like the shoulders, because if I'd put my hand on the upper back of an eagle, it moved. And the medicine man asked me what my experience of the ceremony had been. And I didn't know it, but it was in the morning, a woman brings in 4 sacred foods, and it was taking her longer than normal. So there was some time to fill. So he asked me, so how did it go for you? What do you think? How do you feel? And I said to him, I found what I'm looking for. And that was it. But for him, he was in trouble. He said, what? That's it? You usually have a lot to say, right? Because half French, right? And going to university. So that's it. That's all I had to say. So the main thing that happened, and the main thing like coming to Chartres, is all of a sudden I didn't exist in the world anymore as an if. I had a confidence in myself. And I can see limits and strengths to both of my heritages. I see what the French have done. Like, as I researched my French ancestry, some of my French family in Canada had American Indian slaves, right? More married into American Indian people, right? But at the same time, my own Haudenosaunee people, we beat the crap out of each other and just tried to annihilate the Algonquins next to us before the Great Law of Peace. And now in the US, there is this reckoning that we have a chance to take on if we choose to. Since day one, when Europeans arrived to the New World, American Indians standing there said, "Who are you?" And to this day, we never answered. We need to be able to answer that. Every person on the face of the earth, we're here with an identity, with a purpose. We need to know that. It's our birthright, it's our heritage, and our responsibility and joy. And if we do that, if we overcome the normative pathology of dissociation, I believe it will heal the planet and save our species. So who are you? You're not French, you're not American. Those are nation identities, institutional identities. It's true they have ways wrapped around them, but it isn't the identity through our mother that takes the roots deep into the soil. Who are you? And when you can answer that, the story of creation begins again.
That's very powerful. Thank you. As we conclude, Apela, I think it would be worth saying a little bit more about the dream work in Chartres, because it is groundbreaking in the history of dream awareness and research. What's being done by Apela and her dream team in Chartres, which we'll all participate in when we make pilgrimage there again in August, is profoundly illuminating in terms of our presence there. So tell us a little bit more about how it developed and what the scope is, and the kind of breakthroughs that are beginning to happen through the dream work there in that sacred place.
It was really, I want to step back for a moment, Jim, and that is how do we come to our identity? How do we come to the gifts or powers that we're aligned with in our lives? And for me, Jim Garrison has been one of those forces, because that day at the State of the World Forum, when he said, "I want you to make the prayer," if somebody asks you to pray, Indian wise, you're going to do it, right? But that room, I mean, I never ever stood before a room of 1,000 people. And I say, like, some of the people, the business, the Wall Street guys, they had shoes that were more in value than my total annual income. The air just
indeed.
The air just like crackled with like secular power. It was like, oh, it was awesome, but terrifying at the same time. And then this was new technology, but Jim like pushed me out on the stage, and there was a big screen behind me. It's like, who prays in this kind of situation? And then it just came. And because of that, Jim, like, I didn't know that was possible to happen in me. And then, wow, happens all the time now. So praying all the time in public. Before that, it was a private way to pray, native private way. And then we get to Chartres, and I'm reconciling and calling to my ancestors there. And lo and behold, they showed up. And these people would pull, because Jim had me do the invocation, people would pull me aside and say, "Hey, I had this dream last night." And in my family, like, it's American Indian tradition. We share our dreams in the morning, but I didn't go to a dream lodge or anything. So I would listen when people would tell me about the dreams, and then talked it over with Jim, who was at first unconvinced, but then, all right, we kind of think it through. And over 2 or 3 years, we found a time in the agenda first thing in the morning, because it's a really packed agenda. The process moves intensely, and it's a fire that burns clear and hot. Chartres Mystery School, Chartres Academy. So we found a slot for the dreams. And in year 4, Musica, when we're celebrating 7 liberal arts, which is not too bad in my Indigenous mind, because 7 stars in the Big Dipper, which is right overhead from Chartres, North Star right above the hill and the cathedral. So we celebrate 7 liberal arts as defined in the Middle Ages, do our best at approximating them. And the 4th one, the exact middle of the 7 liberal arts, is Musica. And that year, something happened. One woman's walking up and down the hall carrying this big wooden box about 5 feet long and about, I want to say about 12 feet deep, hollow wooden box. And I'm like, what the heck? And it turned out she was from Barbara Daniels. She's from Germany. And she had just the strong inspiration to bring this instrument with her, which has, it's called a monochord, has like 7 strings or something, and it's all in one chord. She felt it was needed. But of course, there was no space on the agenda. And she's walking up and down the halls with this huge instrument. So we'll come into the dream circle. We could use some sound in the morning to center ourselves when people come in. So she did that. And at the same time, another woman who did organizational development work with feminist groups and corporations, women-led corporations, she did this thing she called glyphing, because when you're dealing with a large group of people over several days to do something with the organization, there's a complexity to it. So she would cartoon or illustrated main points that people would bring up as a visual aid to help her remember things. And when she sat in our circle of dreamers, because we were just sharing dreams, she started like glyphing. And that harkens back to the tradition we have as Native American people, as Indigenous people all over the world, of painting, right? So it started just evolving like that. And now we do Chartres dream work every morning, and we do a presentation to reflect back, because it's good to listen and be present to the dreams in a circle, but then to share a story back is essential. And what we're looking for is, what is the message from that sacred site that's coming through the collective of dreams? We don't analyze dreams, we glyph and we record what people are saying. And of us sit with these big flip chart sheets with all of these cartoons or glyphs on it every day and say, okay, what is the implicate order? What's the message coming through? Sometimes it's exact, right? But the last few years at Chartres were just amazing. And we were getting messages like, act now, you must do something now, direct dream messages. And one little boy, Casper, was 12 years old. And in 2020, the last time we met there in person, he had a dream. And his dream, he kept seeing all kinds of people wearing face masks and being sick. And that year, the number 19 kept coming up, like 19 black dresses. And you could feel an ominous quality to the dreams, but none of us would have predicted a global pandemic, COVID-19. And Casper, that little boy, saw it coming. Other people have dreamt healings for people. Dreams connect and overlap, and a narrative starts emerging. And part of our discipline and our training is paying attention to the dreams as a dream team and as a community. It's the door that opens to the remembrance of the Indigenous mind. And it's a way that's come right out of that hill. Now we've gone virtual, and in the midst of the pandemic, we did dream work, and what we found, I mean, it was horrifying. Someone dreamt of an insect catfish, and like, oh, the pandemic dreams are just what it is, right? And then later, coming out of pandemic, there were a series of dreams about the trickster, a fox, and the fox appeared in dreams for people remotely located on the globe who didn't know each other. And here came the transformer. And the most recent virtual dreams we did with a group of students who are dedicated to peace work. They had 12 days of dream work, Charter dream work. And on the last day, when I saw the direct messages, it was a prayer for peace. Just beautiful. So come to Chartres and experience this beautiful ceremony that's remembered itself to us. And finally, for me, the last day in 2020 at Chartres, after our dream work was done, a dream came to me. And in the dream, I saw myself, other members of our dream team and Chartres community were there, standing beneath these oaks that used to be at the top of the hill before the cathedral, the Temple of the Druids. And I could feel something in my hands, and I looked down, and I was carrying one of the boxes that the ritual set that I had seen when we arrived, the old Gaul ritual set. In my dream, I'm holding a box, a Gaul ritual box. And then I look, and so was everyone else in the dream team. And sure enough, we were about to go virtual. And I didn't know if we even could do it. And we could, because we had the box.
Apela, thank you so much. And as Vivian Falk, who's been to Chartres, just put in the chat box, that group dreaming actually happened, and she knows this to be true, what Apela is saying, because she was there.
Yes. Thank you, Vivian.
Go ahead.
No, I just said thank you, Vivian.
So thank you, Apela. Thank you so much for your disclosure of your journey today, and because how you've embodied as a woman the multiple worlds of the Indigenous and the Western, but also the global, as you participated with Indigenous people literally all over the world in a caring and constructive way. And for your discourse about Chartres and the profound importance of being in that place in an annual pilgrimage. I hope everyone that you can join us in Chartres this August. It's an experience of a lifetime, truly, to be in a place that for the last 3,000, 4,000 years has been associated with the sacred feminine, to go there and to be contained by not only the community and the ritual as an initiatory process, but also to be contained in collective dreaming. That's what happens in Chartres. So it's our hope that you can join us. You'll be meeting Apela probably for the first time, and many others who you see on Humanity Rising. But Apela, thank you so much. This has been profoundly illuminating, and it's made me excited at the heart of my being to get back to Chartres with you. And Eve Ensler is going to join us. If you know Eve from the Vagina Monologues and all the books and plays that she's done. Jackie Lewis, who's a senior minister at the New Collegiate Church in New York. Andrew Harvey, who's a very deep contemporary mystic. Banafsheh Sayad, who's a sacred dancer. Lynn Bell, who you've seen on Humanity Rising, our astrologer. We contain everything in an alignment with the stars. And Ruth Cunningham also. The music that you hear every day on Humanity Rising comes from Ruth. She's a magnificent musician, and we're going to be in the cathedral. We'll walk the labyrinth in the cathedral. We'll go down to what we now call the Mother Tree, where Apela led us that original time going there. It's a magnificent experience of sacred renewal and sacred coherence in community, held by our dreams. So thank you, Apela. Thank you, everyone. That brings our session to a close today.
1 minute.
Those of you who are interested, just a second, join our after chat session. And now Apela will give us our benediction.
I give thanks this morning, ancestors, for your presence and the happiness that I feel even in this virtual distance and unity, still heart to heart, mind to mind. We dance. Ah, Mama. Oh, I know. Amen.
Thank you, Apela. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.